I've always been a private person. It's not that I'm antisocial. I wave to my neighbors, attend the occasional community barbecue, and dutifully drag my trash cans to the curb on the designated days. But my home is my sanctuary, my refuge from the chaos of the outside world. So when I purchased my house in Willow Creek Estates last year, I was prepared for the standard HOA regulations about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. What I wasn't prepared for was Margaret Thornton, known not so affectionately throughout the neighborhood as Karen, and her personal crusade to inspect every inch of every property under her jurisdiction. Margaret had been the president of our Home Owners Association for 7 consecutive years, a tenure marked by ever-increasing restrictions and an enforcement style that bordered on militant. She was in her mid-50s with a meticulously maintained blonde bob that seemed impervious to humidity and wind. Her wardrobe consisted exclusively of pastel pantsuits and pearl necklaces that she would clutch dramatically when describing perceived violations of the community standards she held so dear. My first encounter with Margaret came just 3 weeks after I moved in. I was unpacking in my home office when an aggressive knocking interrupted my thoughts. Opening my front door, I found Margaret standing on my porch, clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced pleasantness that immediately puts one on edge. "I'm Margaret Thornton, president of the Willow Creek Estates Home Owners Association. I'm conducting the quarterly home inspections today." I smiled politely, still naively believing this would be a brief, professional interaction. "Nice to meet you. I'm just getting settled in, but everything should be in order. The previous owners left the place in great condition." "Yes, well, that remains to be seen," she replied, consulting her clipboard with an air of great importance. "We'll need to check both the exterior and interior of the property to ensure compliance with all HOA regulations." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, did you say interior?" "Of course," she nodded briskly. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenant clearly states that the association reserves the right to inspect all aspects of member properties to ensure community standards are maintained. She began to step forward as if the matter was settled. I remained firmly in my doorway, blocking her entry. "I'd like to see that specific regulation, please. I've reviewed the covenant carefully, and I don't recall any provisions for interior home inspections." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't have the specific page with me, but I assure you it's standard procedure. We need to check for unapproved modifications, water damage that could affect adjoining properties, proper window coverings visible from the street." She trailed off, clearly expecting me to step aside. Instead, I held my ground. "I'm not comfortable with an interior inspection without prior written notice and documentation of this requirement. I'd be happy to review any exterior concerns you might have about the property." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been conducting these inspections for 7 years. No one else has ever objected. Are you suggesting you have something to hide?" "Not at all," I replied calmly. "I'm simply exercising my right to privacy within my own home. I'll gladly address any specific exterior concerns and review the regulation you mentioned. If it does exist, as you've described, we can schedule a mutually convenient time for an inspection with proper notice." Margaret's pleasant facade began to crack. "This is most irregular. Delays in inspection could result in fines if violations are later discovered." "I understand the concern," I said, "but I'll need to see the specific regulation before allowing an interior inspection." "I hope you understand." With visible reluctance, Margaret completed her exterior inspection, making several notes on her clipboard about the height of my grass, which was a 1/4 inch too tall, apparently, and the positioning of my garbage cans visible from the street if one stood at a particular angle and squinted. She left with a promise to provide the interior inspection regulation and a thinly veiled warning about starting off on the wrong foot with the HOA. That evening, I combed through the 100+ pages of the HOA covenant. As I suspected, there was no provision for interior home inspections. The document clearly limited the association's authority to exterior elements visible from common areas or affecting adjoining properties. Armed with this knowledge, I felt prepared for Margaret's inevitable return. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, another sharp knock announced her presence on my porch. This time, she had brought reinforcements in the form of Walter Jenkins, the HOA vice president, a retired accountant who followed Margaret around like an anxious shadow, rarely speaking but constantly nodding in agreement with whatever she said. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret began without preamble, "I've brought the relevant section of the covenant regarding inspections." She handed me a single photocopied page with one paragraph highlighted in bright yellow. I read it carefully. The highlighted section stated that the HOA had the right to inspect all exterior elements of the property for compliance with community standards. Someone had added the word interior in ballpoint pen between all and exterior, a clumsy modification that was obviously not part of the original text. "Margaret," I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral, "this document has been altered. The word interior has been added by hand and doesn't appear in the original covenant." Her face flushed slightly, but she recovered quickly. "That was simply a clarification added during our last board meeting. The intention has always been to include interior elements that could affect property values. Intentions and written regulations are different things," I replied firmly. "Unless the covenant is formally amended through the proper channels, with a 2/3 vote of all homeowners as required in Section 3, the current regulations stand, and they do not authorize interior inspections." Walter, who had been silently observing our exchange, suddenly found his voice. "Young man, Margaret has been running this HOA since before you even thought about moving here. Her dedication has kept our property values the highest in the county. A little cooperation wouldn't kill you." "I'm happy to cooperate with all legitimate HOA requirements," I assured him. "But I will not allow unauthorized entry into my home based on regulations that don't exist or have been improperly modified." Margaret's expression hardened. "Very well. The board will be discussing your case at our next meeting. Expect a formal notice of noncompliance." With that, she turned and marched down my walkway, Walter scurrying to keep up with her determined stride. True to her word, I received a notice of noncompliance in my mailbox the following week, citing refusal to permit required inspections and threatening a $50 daily fine until the inspection was completed. Having anticipated this, I had already consulted with an attorney friend who specialized in property law. He confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had no legal grounds for interior inspections without specific covenant provisions or evidence of violations affecting neighboring properties. I drafted a response citing the relevant sections of the covenant, state law regarding property rights, and a polite but firm refusal to pay any fines based on fabricated violations. I sent copies to each board member individually rather than just Margaret, ensuring everyone was aware of the situation. The fines were quietly dropped, but my victory was short-lived. What followed was a campaign of petty harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. I received notices for infractions as minor as excessive birdseed in my feeder, unapproved vegetation, wildflowers that had been planted by the previous owner and approved years ago, and improper mailbox height, which, when measured by an independent party, was exactly at the required 41 inches. Each notice required a formal response, documentation, and sometimes in-person appearances at board meetings. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, all orchestrated by Margaret from her position of authority. But I documented everything meticulously, building a case of targeted harassment that I hoped would never need to be used, but kept ready just in case. The situation came to a head on a Saturday morning in April. I was enjoying a rare day off, sipping coffee on my back patio and reading, when the sound of a gate latch caught my attention. Peering around the corner of my house, I was stunned to see Margaret and Walter entering my backyard through the side gate, clipboards in hand. "Excuse me," I called out, setting down my book and coffee. "What are you doing on my property?" Margaret looked up, seemingly unsurprised to find me home. "Quarterly exterior inspection," she replied with that same artificial pleasantness. "We've had reports of unapproved landscaping modifications in the back garden areas." I walked toward them, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Any exterior inspections need to be scheduled in advance. as per Section 8 of the Covenant. And they certainly don't authorize entering private property through closed gates without permission. We sent a notification email last week. Walter offered, though his shifty gaze suggested otherwise. I received no such email, I replied. And even if you had, electronic notification isn't sufficient for property entry according to our covenant. You need written notice delivered to the property at least 72 hours in advance. I had practically memorized the relevant sections by this point. I'm going to have to ask you both to leave my property immediately. Margaret's pleasant mask slipped completely. This is ridiculous. We are conducting official HOA business. Your continued obstruction is going to result in significant fines. You're trespassing on private property, I countered. Please leave now, or I'll be forced to call the authorities. Call them, Margaret snapped, her face flushing with anger. I'd love to explain to them how you're violating legally binding covenants and interfering with official community business. I pulled out my phone. That's your right. But from where I'm standing, the only violation occurring is your unauthorized presence on my property. I gave them one more chance. Are you leaving voluntarily, or should I make the call? Make it, Margaret hissed, crossing her arms defiantly. Walter looked considerably less confident, but remained at her side. I dialed the non-emergency police number, briefly explained the situation, and requested an officer to document a trespassing incident. Throughout the call, I maintained a calm, reasonable tone while Margaret fumed silently. They'll be here shortly, I informed them after ending the call. You're welcome to wait on the public sidewalk. We are staying right here, Margaret declared. This is HOA property. Actually, it's my property, subject to certain covenant restrictions that don't include unauthorized entry. I corrected her. But suit yourself. The responding officers can sort out. What happened next left me momentarily speechless. Margaret pulled out her own phone, dialed, and after a brief pause announced, "Yes, this is an emergency. I need immediate police assistance." She proceeded to tell the 911 dispatcher that she was being threatened and held against her will while performing her official duties, that I was becoming aggressive, and that she feared for her safety. I stood there in disbelief, listening to her fabricate a dangerous situation out of thin air. Walter looked equally shocked, taking a few steps away from Margaret, as if to distance himself from her false report. When she ended the call, I shook my head slowly. "Margaret, you just filed a false police report. That's a criminal offense. There are no threats here, and you're free to leave at any time. In fact, I've repeatedly asked you to do so." "We'll see who the police believe," she replied with a smug certainty that suggested this tactic had worked for her in the past. The respected HOA president or the troublemaking new resident who refuses to comply with community standards. Thanks to Margaret's 911 call, we didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing but siren silent. 4 officers approached cautiously through the still open side gate, a response appropriate for the dangerous situation Margaret had described, but comically excessive for the reality of 3 middle-aged people standing in a backyard. "What's going on here?" asked the lead officer, a sergeant with a name tag reading Ramirez and the weary expression of someone who had seen too many neighborhood disputes. Margaret immediately launched into her version of events, describing how she was just performing her duties when I became confrontational and threatening, supposedly blocking her exit and creating a hostile environment. Throughout her dramatic recounting, I remained silent, waiting for my turn to speak. When she finished, Sergeant Ramirez turned to me. "And your side of the story, sir?" "I was in my backyard when these individuals entered through my gate without permission or prior notice," I explained calmly. "When I asked them to leave my private property, they refused. I called a non-emergency line to report trespassing, and then Ms. Thornton called 911 with what I believe to be a false report of threats and being held against her will." I gestured to the open gate. "As you can see, no one is being prevented from leaving, and there have been no threats of any kind." Sergeant Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, then looked at Walter. "And you, sir?" Walter's loyalty to Margaret finally reached its breaking point. Well, that is," he stammered, looking between Margaret and the officers. We did enter without specific permission, thinking HOA authority was sufficient. And no, there weren't any threats that I heard. Margaret was perhaps overreacting a bit with the emergency call. Margaret gasped at this betrayal. Walter, that is not what happened at all. Tell them about how hostile he's been, how he's blocked all our inspections. The officers exchanged knowing glances. Sergeant Ramirez addressed Margaret directly. Ma'am, let me make sure I understand the situation correctly. You entered this private property without the owner's permission or a court order, refused to leave when asked, and then called 911 claiming an emergency situation that doesn't appear to exist. Is that accurate? That's not. You're twisting my words, Margaret sputtered. We have authority under the HOA covenant to inspect properties. Do you have documentation of that authority with you? Sergeant Ramirez asked. Margaret reached for her clipboard and produced the same photocopied page with the handwritten modification she'd shown me earlier. The sergeant examined it briefly, his expression making it clear he noticed the alteration immediately. Ma'am, this document appears to have been modified by hand, he observed. Do you have the original, unaltered document? Margaret's composure began to crumble. That's just a clarification of the intent. The HOA has always had inspection rights. Rights to inspect the exterior from common areas, yes. I interjected, retrieving a copy of the complete, unmodified covenant section from my pocket. But not to enter private property without notice or permission. I have the original language here. Sergeant Ramirez reviewed both documents, then handed them back. This appears to be a civil matter regarding the interpretation of HOA regulations, which we can't resolve here. However, there are potential criminal issues we do need to address. He turned to Margaret with an expression that had hardened considerably. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense, as is misuse of the 911 emergency system. The color drained from Margaret's face. I genuinely felt threatened, she insisted, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Based on statements from all parties, including your colleague, there appears to be no evidence of threats or being held against your will, Sergeant Ramirez replied. At minimum, this represents an unnecessary emergency call for what is clearly a civil dispute. He continued, addressing both Margaret and Walter. Both of you are now formally being instructed to leave this property immediately. Failure to comply will result in trespassing charges. Additionally, Ms. Thornton will be documenting this incident regarding the potentially false report. The district attorney's office will determine if charges are appropriate. For the first time since I'd met her, Margaret seemed at a complete loss for words. She clutched her clipboard to her chest, as if it might shield her from the consequences of her actions. Walter, clearly wanting no part of potential criminal charges, was already backing toward the gate. This isn't over, Margaret finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The board will hear about this obstruction. The board will also receive a copy of the police report, I replied calmly, including details about trespassing, filing false reports, and altering official HOA documents. I imagine they'll find it enlightening reading. Under the watchful eyes of 4 police officers, Margaret and Walter finally exited my property. Sergeant Ramirez stayed behind briefly to collect my statement for his report, professionally neutral but with the faintest hint of sympathy in his eyes. We get HOA disputes more often than you'd think, he told me as he prepared to leave. But emergency calls over inspection rights, that's a new one. You might want to consider running for the board yourself next election. Seems like some fresh perspective might be needed. I thanked him for the suggestion and for the department's professional handling of the situation. As the police cruisers pulled away from my curb, I noticed several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the unusual sight of law enforcement in our quiet community. Margaret stood on the sidewalk across the street, her face a mask of humiliation and rage as she watched her authority and reputation crumble before her eyes. 3 days later, I received an official letter from the HOA board, minus Margaret's signature. informing me that Margaret Thornton had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of improper enforcement practices and potential misrepresentation of association authority. The letter included a formal apology for the unfortunate incident at my property and a request for my attendance at a special board meeting to discuss improving transparency and membership relations. As I folded the letter and set it aside, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. All Margaret had wanted was to get inside my house. Instead, she had opened the door to the end of her reign as the neighborhood's most notorious HOA president.